Hey everybody, it's your life science slash biology teacher, Mr. Poser, and today we are starting our fourth unit in biology. It's on life functions. And we're going to start that off today by getting into one of the main topics of all of biology, which is the cell, the basic unit of living things. And as I always like to start these videos, we're going to start with a question here that you may or may not know the answer to, or may or may not have a right answer at all that we'll go over through the course of the video, and hopefully you'll have a better understanding by the end of it. And that question is, how do we decide if something is alive? What does it mean to be alive? And I'll give you a little hint right over here. This guy is called a protocell, and we're going to learn all about this protocell in a little bit. Frankenstein is just there because it's spooky season, and he became alive and stuff. Okay, let's move on. All right, so let's start things off. Let's do a little review before we get into the new stuff here. The cell, all cells are living things, and all living things are made of cells. And what are living things made of? They are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen atoms. If you go back to our unit 2 and we talk about all of our different types of biomolecules, all of our biomolecules contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and most of them contain nitrogen as well. These, like we said, those biomolecules, those atoms compose carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, and also water. All right, so just as a little bit more review here, if we combine two atoms together and make them bond together, that forms a molecule, right? So a molecule like a carbohydrate is made up of many atoms, or a protein is made up of thousands of atoms, right? And if we take smaller versions of those molecules, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, which are called monomers, for example, a monosaccharide or an amino acid or a fatty acid, and we combine those together through bonds, that's what forms a polymer. And living things are made of, or cells are made of polymers, these large carbohydrates, large proteins, large lipids, and large nucleic acids. You need big molecules to form these living things, right? But these biomolecules, when they combine together, they make up cells. And the most basic living thing was just a combination of those 4 different types of biomolecules. And cells have become more complicated now due to evolution, but cells are still the most basic unit of all living things. Every living thing that you've ever learned about ever is made up of 1 or more cells. Some organisms are made of more than 1 cell, which are multicellular, like our cells. We're made up of about trillions of cells. But most living things on Earth, most of the variety of life on Earth is unicellular, meaning that it is only made of 1 cell. And of course, you've probably seen a picture like this before, maybe in 7th grade when you learned about the cell in life science a little bit. And this cell is just kind of like a generalized picture of, like, okay, this is for kids to learn what the parts of the cell are. And this doesn't actually represent what a cell might look like. Okay, we're going to look at that in just a second here. So these unicellular organisms that I was mentioning earlier, they comprise most of the diversity of life on Earth. Okay, so there's a wider variety of bacteria, and another what is this? A domain of organisms called archaea that comprise most of the varieties of living things on Earth. They also comprise the most biomass as well, like the mass of living things are comprised of these unicellular organisms that sometimes are able to reproduce, and in the span of 20 minutes, that's their life cycle. They just reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. And if you were in my class, we looked at these yesterday. We looked at them yesterday, different types of unicellular organisms. Okay, but when we're in a multicellular organism, cells become specialized, meaning that they become really, really good at one function. Okay, if you're really good at English in school, you could say English is your specialty. Or somebody who studies law but studies like a particular branch of law, they specialize in that form of law. I don't know why I thought of that. Or a doctor specializes in one area, like a ear, nose, throat doctor, or a cardiologist or something like that. They specialized in one part of the body. Okay, cells are kind of the same way. They are born and they are produced in such a way that they're specialized at one particular function. And what that process is called, it's called cell differentiation. They become different from each other, but they become really, really good at one job. And as I said before, humans have trillions of cells, Hey, but they're not cells like this one that are just very general and don't really seem to be good at any one thing. They're highly specialized and they come in lots of different shapes and sizes because their job is to do that one thing. The one thing. You have one job, all these cells. Okay, so all of your cells are specialized for one particular function. Okay, so another differentiation that we have to make between cells is that there's eukaryotic cells and there's prokaryotic cells. Now, the cell that I showed you earlier and the cells that make up you are what are called eukaryotic cells. They have a nucleus and they have structures called organelles within them. They're highly organized, they're compartmentalized, and they have organelles with specific processes. So all multicellular organisms are eukaryotic. I was about to say pretty much all, but no, all multicellular organisms are eukaryotic, meaning that if you're a living thing made up of more than one cell, your cells have structures within them, okay? And something that I mentioned in this class before is that these cells have organelles, and they're kind of like organs within a human being, right? So if you're a person, you have a liver, you have a stomach, you have a heart, you have lungs, you have a brain, and each one of those serves a particular function within your body. Okay, it's similar to a cell. Cells have organelles. They have structures within them that serve a particular function, right? Prokaryotic cells, like bacteria and this other group of organisms called archaea, do not have a nucleus or organelles, and they're much smaller than eukaryotic cells. Much smaller, much less complex. They're much simpler. And their DNA just kind of floats around in the middle of the cell, but it's very organized and packaged in the eukaryotic cell. Okay, so let's talk about the structures of the cell. Some of the structures of the cell are shared between all living things. For example, a cell membrane is shared between all living things, and that's what's called a subcellular component. It's not necessarily an organelle. Encloses the cell and it controls the movement of materials in and out of the cell. And as I said before, all cells, whether you're a bacterial cell or if you're a liver cell in a human being, they all have a cell membrane. And this is really kind of like the gatekeeper. It decides what comes in and what goes out of the cell, and it holds everything together. If the cell membrane ruptures too much, well, it can reform, but the cell membrane is really what holds everything together as well. Okay, the most important structure in eukaryotic cells, now the rest of these organelles are just going to be in eukaryotic cells. This is the organelle that stores genetic information or the instructions for making proteins, which we'll study a lot later this year, and those instructions are called DNA. Okay, so the DNA, this is almost like the bank of the cell a little bit. Maybe some analogies also consider it like, oh, if the cell is a city, it's a city hall because it tells it what to do. That's true. But its job is to hold and contain and organize all of the DNA, all the genetic information within a living thing. Okay? So that's the nucleus. It's always usually at the center. The endomembrane system, which is made up of 3 different structures, 2 make up the endoplasmic reticulum, and the other is called the Golgi apparatus. Endo means within, membrane means, well, membrane. There's lots of different membranes inside of the eukaryotic cell. Okay, so there's the cell membrane, or also known as the plasma membrane on the outside, but there's also tons and tons of membranes on the inside that help organize that eukaryote. Okay, these are membranes that produce, package, and transport proteins and lipids. Okay, so a cell needs to make and produce proteins and lipids in order for it to function normally, and the job of the endomembrane system is to help make them and ship them where they need to go. Okay, so it's almost like the post office of the cell. All right, the next one is something that we've talked about before. It is the mitochondrion. That is the double membrane organelle that produces ATP or provides energy for the cell. Hey, I'll say it. It's the powerhouse of the cell, right? It provides that chemical energy, ATP, through cellular respiration so that the cell can do its normal functions. Without ATP, the cell is going to die. And the mitochondrion's job is to produce as much ATP as possible in order for that cell to be functional. Okay, so we've talked about that a lot of different times. Plant cells have some distinct differences from animal cells. Okay, so what we've looked at so far, we're animals, so we have animal cells. The structures that we're going to talk about now are structures that our cells do not have. Okay, so we have an endomembrane system, we have a nucleus, we have mitochondria, but we do not have a cell wall, we don't have a central vacuole, and we don't have a chloroplast, which we're going to look at here in a second. All right, but the cell wall is a rigid carbohydrate wall that surrounds the cell membrane. Okay, so if you're a plant, that means that not only do you have a cell membrane keeping contents in and making sure things come in and come out at the appropriate rate, but you also have a cell wall that helps maintain the rigidity of the cell and provides it a little protection from outside forces. Okay, so you have a cell wall if you're a plant cell. But something else you have is also a large vacuole, which is a fluid-filled sac. It's got another membrane around it, and is for storage of materials. Okay, so it's uses to store water. It uses it to store nutrients. It temporarily houses waste before it has to get rid of waste. Okay, so this plant cells. If you're a plant cell, you have a cell wall and you have a vacuole. You don't have a large vacuole. In animal cells, you have some smaller ones, but you definitely don't have a cell wall if you're an animal cell. Okay? And the last thing that plant cells have that animal cells don't is something else that we've talked about a lot, which is a chloroplast, and that's the organelle that carries out photosynthesis, and which converts energy from light into energy-rich molecules, such as glucose. Okay, so we've beat photosynthesis to death. We know all about it already. Let's move on. The chloroplast is what does that. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to talk about in this video is we're going to fill out this diagram together. Go ahead and try to figure out, okay, all the arrows on this diagram, they are pointing to structures that we have discussed in this video. So go ahead and see if you can't label it by yourself. Go ahead and pause it, see if you can't do it. And then, yeah. All right, if you paused the video, great. If you didn't, that's okay. We're going to fill out this diagram. Here we go. All right, so check it out. Both of these cells, here's an animal cell, here's a plant cell, they both have an endomembrane system surrounding this big purple thing, which is the nucleus, which contains the DNA. Okay, so the endomembrane system packages, ships, contains proteins and lipids, to sends them where they need to go. The nucleus contains all the instructions for the cell, all the DNA. Here's the mitochondrion making ATP. The cell membrane, both cells have a cell membrane, which controls what comes in and out of the cell. Here's the plant cell. It has the cell wall, this rigid structure that maintains its shape and rigidity. Here's the chloroplast, the center for photosynthesis, making glucose. And there's the vacuole in the plant cell, which is good for storage. All right, so I'm going to ask you to know, if you're in my class, I'm going to ask you to know all these structures on this diagram. So this will be something that we'll come back to quite a few times. All right, but let's recap the question that I asked you at the beginning of the video. How do we decide if something is alive? What does it mean to be alive? Well, hopefully you learned over the course of the video that you need to be made of cells, okay? And your cells have to be made of molecules, and your molecules have to be made of atoms, right? But at what point do the molecules become alive? What point do the atoms become alive? Well, when you're alive, you're able to do some things that living things aren't able to do, simply put. Okay? So if you're a living thing, you're able to maintain an internal environment, meaning that you're able to separate the inside of your body or the inside of your cell membrane. You're able to keep that separate from the outside of the cell membrane. You're able to reproduce RNA. You're able to make new genetic instructions. You're able to metabolize and use energy or use molecules and convert them into forms of energy that you can use. You're supposed to be able to react to changes, and you're supposed to be able to get rid of the things that you don't need. You're supposed to be able to dispose of waste. Okay, so the very first living thing, when did molecules become cells? Well, it was believed that the first living thing looked something like this. It was called a protocell, which is the very, very first life form on Earth, which is basically just a membrane bubble with some RNA, some nucleic acids that was able to copy itself. And therefore, it's a living thing. It's able to do all 5 of these things. Okay, so that's what it means to be alive, is to be able to do all of these things if you look at it from a biological standpoint. Okay, and cells can do all that stuff. All right, let me know if you have any questions. That'll be the end of this video, and we will see you next time.